This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. We know how important the first few years are to young children when it comes to learning, but early education often gets short shrift when it comes to prioritizing news coverage. Not so at Minnesota Public Radio. That's where Kyra Miles is on the early education beat. She joins us now to talk about what she's learning there, what she can share with you, our journalist listeners, and everybody else. Kyra, thanks for making time for EWA Radio.
Of course.
For millions of families, having reliable childcare lets the adults go to work or go to school. I mean, that just seems so obvious and a no-brainer, and yet it's something that we as a country struggle to provide. Can you talk a little bit about what you see right now in the landscape?
In the landscape of early childhood, wow, that's a big question. I mean, I think the simplest way to put it is that demand is high, but supply is low. So there's a lot of demand for childcare, affordable childcare, but there are not a lot of childcare centers. There are not a lot of providers anymore. They're either aging out of the profession or leaving because it's not very profitable. Tuition costs are rising as well as expenses. So I think that's the overview, the overhead view of it.
I'm thinking also, of course, about the pandemic. And one thing that did is for a lot of families who thought that they had a reliable system for where to stash their kids during the day, suddenly discovered that they didn't. And I think it gave a lot of people a glimpse of what daily life has been like for struggling and particularly low-income households since the beginning of time, I guess I would say. And I'm wondering, do you think that changed any attitudes or shifted, priorities and focus? Is that something that's come out of the pandemic?
I can only really speak to Minnesota because that's where I started this early ed beat, and that's where I've been learning the most about early education and early childhood and what that looks like. I think before the pandemic, especially legislators already knew that the childcare sector was struggling. And I think the pandemic only just exacerbated those issues even more. Now, there was, pandemic era funding that came out of that kind of helped buoy some of those issues, but those struggles still persist. But I do think it's more on the forefront of I think education in general is now more on the forefront of people's minds since the pandemic. It kind of really pushed it to the forefront of parents' eyes and the public's eyes as well, as we saw how children and families were struggling.
If I'm a parent of a young child and I need childcare in Minnesota right now, what do my options look like?
Well, as you know, Minnesota is one of the most expensive states when it comes to childcare. I think it's something like the fourth most expensive, per capita or something like that. Your options are public or private childcare, and that's going to be across the board in America from what I've seen. This mixed delivery is kind of the popular idea of looking at it. I guess you have family childcare, you have Head Start, and you have privately owned childcare centers.
And we talked just a moment ago about the pandemic and that there was some federal funding, and that came from ESSER, from federal to sort of backfill some of that support. But also, Minnesota has taken some strides to try to boost funding as well. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I was going to say that Minnesota legislators have really been able to keep that pandemic era funding going throughout the state with state dollars in some cases. They extended the child care grant program for families, for low income families, and for providers to help them with cost of staff and expenses for the childcare. So it's currently in the works too for some grants to extend to middle income families to make it so that families only pay 7% of their income towards childcare. So this is definitely a state where it's in the works in the legislature to keep that funding going and to make sure that it's affordable for families. Our governor actually has like this big campaign to make Minnesota the best state to raise a family. So it's big here.
There were some changes, though, for the legislature in how those providers could spend some of the state money, and that's caused some ripples, hasn't it?
Yeah, so at first, the money for pandemic era grants they were able to use it kind of for anything. It was supposed to be for compensation, but they also had some wiggle room to be able to use it for expenses. Now, with the state funding grant, they can only use it for compensation. So it's good in the sense that providers are now able to provide their staff with livable wages for the most part, but they can't use any wiggle room for expenses. So they're kind of struggling on that end too. So it's a balance. It's always a give and take, I feel like sometimes when it comes to early childhood funding.
This is just one piece of your beat, of course. When we talk about early education, childcare is a big piece of that, but so are the little learners. Can you talk a little bit about being thrown into sort of the deep end of a very big piece of the beat? What do you know now that you didn't know, let's say, even just a year ago?
Oh my gosh. It almost doesn't fully translate being a K-12 reporter to early childhood just because of the way the funding works and who you're talking to and what people care about it, right? I have really looked at the beat as prenatal to 5, and I've also looked at it as not just early childhood education, but early childhood in general, because I think it's really important to look at early childhood reporting as the whole child. It's not just their education, it's also their health, it's also their parents' health, it's also, the environment that they're existing in.
Well, let's talk about that because you mentioned, of course, parental health. And one piece of that is parental mental health issues. And you had a terrific story recently on postpartum depression. How does that fit into your approach to the early ed beat?
Well, when I said prenatal to 5, I mean that includes parents and pregnant caregivers. So the health of the child, the mental and physical health of the child is directly tied to the health of the parents. So if the parents are experiencing disparities, the children are too. And so it's kind of like looking at the root of the problems or the root of the solutions as well.
When you approach those stories, do you have a lot of flexibility in your newsroom and how you get to choose these? I mean, I know being from the K-12 beat, so much is driven by agendas and meetings and school boards. Out there just sort of hammering things away, or are there standing meetings and things like that that you have to cover?
So that's what I actually love about early childhood is there aren't really standing meetings. I don't have to go to school
Ah,
board
no
meetings.
meetings.
I know.
Everybody's coming over to Riyadh now, Kyra. You've done it.
It's actually very nice, and I think I do have a lot of wiggle room in this newsroom because I'm pioneering this beat at Minnesota Public Radio. So we haven't had an early childhood reporter ever in the history of this newsroom, and so it's a blessing and a curse. I say it's a blessing because every story is new and every story is important and we haven't had it on our airways before or on our website, but also that means that I don't really have anything to look back on to be able to like guide my reporting, and so it's kind of figuring it out as we go. But luckily I've been able to connect with local early childhood advocates and legislators and parents and providers to kind of help me get the lay of the land of what's going on with early childhood in Minnesota.
What makes an early ed story good for radio versus for the website? I mean, when you're thinking about, okay, what am I going to pitch this week? What are some of the things that are driving you? Are those audiences the same or different? What do you know about who you're writing or speaking for?
Writing for radio and writing for web are definitely very different. In terms of audiences, I'm not 100% sure about all the demographic information. Leave that to our marketing and membership team. But I know they are slightly different audiences or they experience the news slightly differently. So when I'm thinking about radio, I'm of course thinking about sound first. So for example, in a radio story about early childhood, I want to get some kid sounds if I can. I think the biggest difference between K-12 and early childhood is that I can't really get kids' voices in as much because some of them can't talk yet. So I can, so I try to prioritize like getting babbles or little toddler screams and stuff like that in the radio story just to like kind of center the listener in the scene and making sure I get also parents and providers' voices as well. In the web version, I tend to, since again, like I said, this is kind of new for our state in terms of reporting deeply on early childhood issues. I try to make sure I include context and expand more on what's going on politically and what it's looking like in the legislature.
Where your audience is finding you in terms of where your sources finding you, reaching out with stories? Are you on social media? We're talking with a lot of reporters right now, sort of moving beyond into the post what Twitter was world. And I'm curious what you're using to reach out to people.
Email.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, email, social media, sometimes usually Facebook. I find I'm sure a lot of education reporters can relate that Facebook is sometimes a gold mine for finding parents to be able to talk to. I'm not really on Twitter anymore since the whole X takeover. And so the main way I've been able to find parents is through Facebook, sometimes through TikTok. I get ideas too. I'm able to reach out to people. We're actually currently working on here at NPR a way to engage that early childhood audience a little bit more directly. We're thinking of maybe doing something with SMS messaging or maybe some kind of FAQ section on our website. So it's something that we're thinking about and we're trying to figure out as well. But how do we engage this audience and how do we engage an audience that is kind of in flux currently? Because you only have kids from 0 to 5 for so long before then they enter the beast of the K-12 system. So we're looking at that too.
We're talking with Kyra Miles of Minnesota Public Radio about the early ed beat. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes Podcast. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Kyra, has there been some good news lately on the early ed beat in Minnesota? I mean, we talk a lot about disparities, we talk about inequities. Have there been some big wins?
Yeah, very big wins. I mean, when I first came into this beat, the legislator had just passed a $300 million spending bill to boost children, youth, and families. That included a new Department of Children, Youth, and Families. It included that funding that I was talking about for providers and for families to be able to afford childcare. Yeah, definitely some wins. I think some happy stuff too is just like when new childcares are able to open, and looking at that and being able to hear from families about successes, I guess, because there is a lot of losses sometimes.
When you look at the K 12 beat and you look at the early education beat, are there challenges that are specific to early ed that if I'm a new reporter that I want to be thinking about or be prepared for? You talked about one of them, and that is finding, children's voices, which we're always telling reporters get more kids' voices in it, but doing a story on newborns, there's not much you can do.
Yeah, that was my favorite part actually of being a K-12 reporter is getting student voices and talking to students. Like I said, I think it's important for you to get the voices of people who are directly affected by the issues that you're reporting on. But I've kind of had to shift more towards getting parents and providers' voices in my stories, which are equally as important, especially when we're talking about legislation. And I've also found myself listening more as a reporter, especially because I don't have children myself. So for middle and high school students, when I would talk to them, I would kind of be like, okay, yeah, I can relate. I remember middle school. I remember high school. I know what it was like. But now I find myself being more of a listener and an observer, which is great because I'm learning a lot. And I find that people I interview are excited to tell me about it and have someone who is actively listening and really listening to what they're saying and their experience.
That is a great lesson, and that's a great takeaway to think about that. And now I'm thinking about all the times when I play back interview tapes and I just say to myself, stop talking. I mean, I'm sure we all go through that, right? When you realize you've just not let them get to where they're going to go.
Yeah, it's been really fun for me. I mean, challenges, I guess, is like I said, finding those unique voices, and also I think just like having to think differently because the funding is like completely flipped for early ed. So for K-12, it's like federal funding is the largest, and then like individual donations or funding is the smallest. But it's completely flipped for early ed because it's a largely private sector. So most of the funding is coming from the parents and the families, and the least of the funding is coming from the federal government. So you have to flip the way you think. But I mean, it's exciting. I feel like I'm learning a lot about birth and I'm learning a lot about early childhood development. It's information that I think not a lot of people get that kind of direct pool of library, I guess, of knowledge at my age, I guess. So.
I'm wondering if you notice things now when you walk into a daycare center, and what are you looking for? When I would walk into a classroom, I'm paying attention to what's on the walls, or which direction is the teacher's desk facing? Are they grouped in rows or in little pods? I mean, all those kinds of little details that can sometimes tell you something about how the classroom is operating. Do you find that you can go into a daycare center now, or whether it's a home environment or whether it's a classroom in a school, and kind of get a sense of what the room is like?
Yes and no. I'm not sure I'm quite there yet. It's been less than a year since I've been on this beat, and so I'm still learning, and I don't have a full grasp on everything that's going on here, and I'm still trying to figure that out. But it is interesting going into early ed classrooms or early ed spaces because it's completely different from K-12. I feel like most of the times I'm looking at how many providers are in the room because ratios are a big thing. And Minnesota has a pretty low ratio, which is another reason why it's so expensive. It's like 1 to 4 for infants, which is pretty low. But also, if you think about it, how was one person caring for 4 babies? That's like, so it kind of makes sense. So I'm looking at how many providers are in the room, and looking at how many children are in the room and how they're spread out. I'm not as much looking at what's on the walls and like the toys and stuff, but just looking at how they're interacting with each other and with their providers, because at that age, relationships are really important.
What are some of your go-to sources for data and research on early ed? If I'm an education reporter and I want to put somebody on speed dial or book tab.
Unfortunately, I'm finding there really aren't that many go-to sources for early ed, mainly because of that mixed delivery that I was talking about earlier. So federal data is really kind of like only contained for like Head Start and Early Head Start because those are federally and state funded, but the majority of people are going through private options. So I found that local early childhood advocacy groups you're going to find the best data for your specific area. But in terms of national data that is like looks more holistically at the childcare sector, it's really difficult to find. There are some national groups like 0 to 3 that have state by state guides that may be good to look at, but you really do have to look for specific surveys and data from your specific area because it's usually kind of grassroots stuff.
What are some story ideas for reporters who may want to do more on younger learners and even that 0 to 3 group, even if they may not be dedicated to the early ed beat?
Well, if you can look at preschool enrollment numbers, I think that would be good. It can give you insight on what's coming for K through 12 in a few years. You can also ask the local state office. Here it's the Department of Human Services. It will be the Department of Children, Youth, and Families later that oversees childcare for provider numbers. Does it match the number of children 0 to 5 in your country or state? Is there not enough? Is there too much? I don't know. That could be something you could look at. I'd also reach out to pediatric or maternity offices to ask what the biggest issues they're seeing. Maybe it's vaccines. Again, that's something that you could see later down the road in K through 12 settings. Or maybe you'll get some insight into new medical initiative for children. You could look at birth weight data, which could be an indicator for outcomes. Like I said, also look at it as the whole child. So you can think about it as education, but also think about everything that is affecting a child's development in those first few years.
A story that I love, and I just think it's so fascinating, is when you talk to a school district or a state demographer and how precisely they're able to predict how many new classrooms they're going to need based on the birth rates. And it's pretty incredible how accurate they are. I mean, they come sometimes within, a tenth of a percentage point of what the actual enrollment growth will be. Obviously, things like the pandemic and their downturns, and we talk about all of these enrollment cliffs that are coming with the downturn in the birth rate, but a conversation with the demographer for your state and ask what they're predicting in the need and ask them to see their track record can sometimes be a pretty illuminating story.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. I'm like, do we have a state demographer? I'm sure we do. But again, this is what I'm talking about. I'm still learning. I'm still getting used to everything. So now I'm like Googling my state demographer. Okay.
Well, you're still learning, but you're getting up on that curve pretty fast, Kyra. I mean, I have to say. The early ed finance piece, though, does sound really complicated, and it sounds like there are some good intentions, but getting those dollars into these providers and to the classrooms is easier said than done. And it's not even that easy to say.
I don't want to give everybody like spoilers or whatever, but stories that I've been thinking about like the way capitalism and childcare interact in a way that isn't always beneficial to children, or like how like the arguments about universal pre-K, like what does that actually mean in practice, and what does it mean when legislatures are advocating for universal pre-K? Is that actually the best way to get children a good early head start? So there's some really interesting things that are really interesting for me to look into. And I think it's interesting for our audience as well. It's not the same K-12, again, the school board meeting debrief.
Listen, I would read that capitalism story and I'd listen to you tell it on Minnesota Public Radio. So get going on that one if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Kyra, I wanted to know what advice you have for reporters when they're thinking about covering early childhood education and bringing an equity lens to it. The idea that pretty much every family who needs to pay for private childcare is going to find it a struggle, but it's certainly going to be a much bigger struggle for those who are relying on public programs that may simply just not have enough space or resources to stretch to meet the need.
I think it goes back to the listening and observing. So what I've done is when I was talking about local early childhood advocacy groups, I've also connected with local early childhood advocacy groups who specifically are looking at one particular demographic. So there are advocacy groups that are looking at the Native American population in Minnesota that I'm in contact with. There are those that are really focused on the Black and Brown communities. There are those that are focused on the immigrant communities. So I think if you're able to connect with those groups and talk to them and listen to them and hear them, I think that'll really help you get a good understanding of what's going on in those disparities. And two, they're probably already working on solutions and equity solutions. And so being, a reporter, you can kind of bring those to light as well. And so maybe they can get some more traction.
To me, that sounds like that's really the value of having this separate beat too, is you have the time to build those relationships. The story's not a one-off, right? You're not parachuting in to talk about those issues, but you're saying, I'm here for the proverbial long haul.
Yeah, I think something I would like to do with my early childhood beat, if I can, if I have the time and the resources, is to do something that follows a child. I don't know if it's 0 to 3 or 3 to 5 or something like that, because so much is happening, not only developmentally, but also like within their schooling and the way that they're going about their education, the way their parents are going about and thinking about their education, like financially as well. So that's something that I also think would be interesting. If you have the capacity to do that, that'd be really cool.
I love those kinds of projects. Oregon Public Broadcasting has followed the same group of middle schoolers all the way up through high school. And of course, there's a famous British documentary series called 7 Up, which you probably know about, where they start with the children at age 7 and follow them they reunite with them every 7 years. And they've done it, and now those adults are in their 60s. It's pretty incredible. Was moving over to the early ed beat, was it what you thought it was going to be? I mean, where were some of the surprises?
I will say I think I was a little bit naive in thinking that transitioning from K-12 to early ed would be like, it's all education reporting. It's fine. I got it. And I do have it, but it is very different. The way you think about it is different. Like the way it's structured is different. So I would say if you're interested in doing an early ed story, do it. Please do it. But just think about it. You have to get a little creative in the way that you're thinking about it because it is different. I feel like it's also making me think differently about what was I doing when I was 0, 2, 3, 4, 5. I was asking my mom, I'm like, how did y'all afford childcare? Because it's like the same amount as like a college tuition at this point. And these are parents that are also at their lowest spending ability at that point in their lives for the most part. So yeah, it's a lot, but it's fun.
And it's an impossible decision for a lot of people, especially since it's often the woman who will stay home and exit the workforce and give up that seniority and that tenure to stay home because it's a wash. Whatever she was earning would have gone just to childcare.
Yeah. So, like I said, talking to parents is great and like what they've been doing to pay for childcare, what decisions they've had to make to pay to childcare.
You can give me an example?
Well, I of course the example is of, people leaving work because it's cheaper to just leave work to wash that salary instead of paying a salary's worth for childcare. People have taken extra jobs. Some people open their own childcare. They open a family childcare. It's a separate license than a commercial license. You can only have up to like 10 children, at least in Minnesota. And so they'll be like, well, if I'm taking care of my own kid, might as well make some money taking care of a couple other kids as well. So those are some options that people have had as well.
Kyra, you were part of EWA's New to the Beat program. It's always delightful to be able to check in on a former rookie. How are you feeling about things generally? How's the education reporting going overall?
It's good. It's good. I like this shift that I did. It was funny because I really enjoyed reporting K through 12 and I knew I wanted to stay in education journalism even as like I moved to a different, part of the state and I also changed beats. And so I still like it. I like being able to connect to education reporters. I think EWA is like the best thing that I could have ever been connected with in my journalism life. I don't know of a lot of other beats that have a specific organization that connects you to reporters all over the country and gives you all those different perspectives and supports you in the way that EWA does. So I'm always happy to talk with EWA and go to the national conference convention and everything.
Well, the National Conference, National Seminar is coming up next month in May, and we're going to have a full house, Vegas pun intended. It's going to be fantastic. Are you excited?
Oh, I'm so excited. I've never been to Vegas before. I'm so excited.
No, you're
I'm
supposed to say
excited about
I'm coming
learning.
to learn. I'm going to meet. I'm going to network. I'm going to fill my Rolodex.
Right.
Yes, yes. And I
Yes.
might see Adele. Okay. All right. All right. Fair enough. Fair enough. Kyra Miles is the early education reporter for Minnesota Public Radio. And as you just heard, a very proud member of EWA. And we're very proud to have her. Kyra, thanks for making time.
Thank you, Emily.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.